Everybody, good afternoon. My name is Adela Pineda, and I am the director of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. I am also an alumna from LLILAS, and as I stepped into this position this semester, I thought of reinvigorating our community of alumni because I think what LLILAS provided me as a scholar and as a person is the most valuable thing that I can say now. And this is what I wanted to put forward to our community of students and faculty, but also to the audience at large that is listening to us right now. I don't think there is a better way to begin this series than to introduce Professor Gerardo Otero, who is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the president of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, as you know, one of the most important associations for the study of Latin America in the world. He is a sociologist, a political economist, and a professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. He has published over 100 articles, chapters, and books. Among them, I should quote Farewell to the Peasantry, Political Class Formation in Rural Mexico, and The Neoliberal Diet, Healthy Profits, Unhealthy People, a fascinating study on the relationship between inequality, neoliberalism, and health problems. Today, though, he's not going to be talking about this topic, but a most urgent and contemporary one. Was there a left turn in Latin America? Building a Social Democracy Index. This is the title of the presentation. And let me welcome you, Gerardo, back to LLILAS in virtual space.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. For me, it's an incredible honor to be invited by the institution that also allowed me the first opportunity to go into graduate studies and to deep into Latin American studies. And so I have a particular appreciation for the University of Texas at Austin, also because my father also went to school there. And in fact, I learned English there because I was 11 and 12 years old when we were there. So I went to elementary school in the first year of junior high. So yeah, I mean, Austin always has tremendous memories for me. So it's a particular honor for me to be doing this lecture today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerardo. So we just let you tell us about the topic you want to address.
Okay, let me try to share my screen then. And we'll get started. So, well, the lecture is called, Was There a Left Turn in Latin America? And this is a question that generated a tremendous debate after a seminar article in 2006. And I'm bringing this up again because the question, I think, has become relevant again, you know, with all the changes there were after the commodities boom, and which has been associated to a very large extent to a condition of possibility for the left to emerge. You know, I mean, the fact that the left was able to engage in social policies of redistribution and so on and so forth has a lot to do with the fact that the commodities boom made it affordable. So, but still, I want to cover the following topics. First, I'm going to zoom out of Latin America and very briefly outline the historical strategies of social transformation, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, in which were strategies that actually came from before, from the French and American revolutions. And then I will give you some background data on growth and the labor share of the gross domestic product. That's what GDP means for non-economists, gross domestic product. And then I will plunge into the debate in Latin America between traditional Marxists and liberal Democrats. And I will try to adjudicate in this debate by asking, well, how leftist is the Latin American left? And the way I will try to do it as a sociologist and an empirical sociologist is by plunging into data, and generating data to answer the kinds of questions that emerged in this debate. So to that effect, I developed this social democracy index. And finally, I will present some conclusions, which I'm not sure if they're going to be a little anticlimactic, but we'll see when we get there. So on the historical strategies of transformation, I can identify three, and this is not my identification, but this comes from one of my major professors at the University of Wisconsin for my sociology PhD, Eric Olin Wright, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But in his opus magnum, Envisioning Real Utopias, he has a long chapter where he talks about this. The first one, the ruptural, can also be identified as the Leninist strategy of transformation, is predicated on the direct assault on the state in order to smash capitalism. I mean, that's the whole point. And so violence is a requirement for this particular ruptural strategy, okay? I would say that that strategy in Latin America was mostly defeated ultimately, except perhaps for the case of Cuba. All the other cases became absorbed into electoral politics, in a way were domesticated. And then there is the autonomist or communitarian or interstitial left. What this means is that this is a type of left that doesn't want to engage by any means with the state. And so it takes refuge in parts of society that are not colonized by capitalism or the state. And then there's the social democratic or the symbiotic option. I guess one important distinction between the ruptural and the social democratic option is that the ruptural tends to have a zero-sum logic. What one force loses, the other one wins. In the social democratic option, it is symbiotic in the sense that it can be predicated on a positive sum logic. Everybody can win with this particular option. Some empirical figures here on the rise of the Latin American left. By 2010, and this started, I guess, with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela at the end of the 90s. But by 2010, more than 60% of the region's governments self-designated as left, and gaining over 50% of Latin Americans' electoral favor. Okay, so this is a very significant phenomenon in quantitative terms. So, in order to assess the extent to which the Latin American left was really left, I've already done all these number crunching, and I will present to you the results of my crunching of numbers, which I think that particular cartoon kind of tells that part of the story. But I'm going to start with these larger economic data, per capita GDP during the commodities boom years. And these are all comparable constant dollars, which have been deflated to 2010. And the data come from the Federal Reserve economic database. This is from the Central Bank of the United States. They did not necessarily generate this data, but they have a fantastic database, which compiles all this information from a number of reputable sources. So what we see here is, kind of surprisingly, that Venezuela was at the top in terms of per capita GDP almost the entire period, to be displaced at the end by Chile. Uruguay was also very high. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. I mean, these are the middle, higher income countries, I guess. Colombia, perhaps too, and Ecuador. But Bolivia and Nicaragua are really at the bottom. I mean, they have very, very low levels of per capita GDP. And in spite of that, there was a bit of an improvement there. And so the following chart compares or tries to figure out what was the change between 2014 and 1999 in terms of per capita GDP. So this is how the numbers in the countries stack up. This is ordered according to the ranking that was occupied in 2014. All right. So we see that Chile, Venezuela, Uruguay occupy the upper places. Mexico and Colombia are somewhere in the middle. Bolivia and Nicaragua, not surprisingly, are still at the bottom. Now, let me explain why I'm including Mexico and Colombia in this sample of countries. The reason is very straightforward, that Mexico and Colombia have been two of the staunchest neoliberal countries. Mexico, at least until 2018, right? Because in 2018, there was for the first time since 1936, I guess, Mexico elected a left of center government. And so numbers will probably change, although they had the extremely bad luck of having the pandemic, just 1 year after being elected. So we'll see what happens there. But that's the reason why Mexico and Colombia make it to the sample. It's mostly a sort of control group. It's for comparison with all the other countries which did have self-designated leftist governments. So this is the percentage change between 2014 and 1999. So, I mean, what we see here is that, well, Mexico is at the very bottom, but it is mostly, well, I guess Colombia here represents a bit of an unexpected outcome, because it still represented, in spite of the fact that it doesn't have a left of center government, it had a considerable change in GDP. The question, however, is, I mean, GDP even per capita is still an average, right? So we have to, I mean, that's why we find these kind of analysis unsatisfactory, and why we think it's important to develop a social democracy index. And to do that, we're going to have to attend to the debate that has happened in Latin America. Before we do that, I'm going to do a further comparison of GDP in terms of the share of the GDP that goes to labor, because I mean, that is very important, right? And I'll give you one extreme example, Qatar, this oil exporting country. In that case, only about 17% of GDP goes to labor. The rest goes to capital. So that's a massive inequality. In the case of the two wealthiest countries in the Americas, what we see here is that Canada has always, the workers in Canada have always had a larger share of the GDP than workers in the United States. And this is in each case with respect to their own country's GDP, all right? It could be that workers in the US still make more money than workers in Canada, because the pie to distribute is larger comparatively to Canada. But the reason I did this exercise was to try to look for a parameter against which I could compare Latin American countries in this indicator of the labor compensation share of the GDP. So as we can see here, I mean, Canada had much better days in the early 1990s. It's around the time when I came here. And then, you know, it really kind of collapsed. The US had a blip here during the Clinton years. It started to go down in 2001, 2002. But Canada's share of labor compensation has been more or less stable around 65 percentage points since the boom period, you know, which is the one that we're considering. So what I did is, in this graph, I am comparing the labor compensation share of GDP as a percentage of Canada's, all right? So Canada I'm taking as a sort of parameter for, you know, what could be a higher level of GDP. So one surprise here is how Ecuador went even above Canada's share of labor compensation. All right, that means that Ecuadorian workers were getting a higher share of the GDP than even Canadian workers. Other interesting figures here is that in the case of Brazil, well, I mean, it's going up, not very dramatically, but it is going up all of that period. In the case of Colombia, however, it's going down. In the case of Argentina, remember the first years of the 2000s, Argentina was really in the doldrums. They had a succession of several presidents in just a couple of years. And then came the Kirchners, and that helped to materialize a considerable increase in the labor compensation share of the GDP. Surprisingly, that didn't happen in the case of Bolivia. Even after the election of Evo Morales, you know, that still tends to go down. In Venezuela, you know, it's very fluctuating. Mexico is, you know, pretty much at the bottom as usual. So that gives you another perspective. By the way, Nicaragua is absent here simply because of the fact that it is not contained in the data set of the FRED, you know, the Federal Reserve Economic Database. So I'm going now into the conceptual debate between traditional Marxists and liberal Democrats in their attempts to assess the left in Latin America. For traditional Marxists, there was no real advancement beyond neoliberalism. These leftist governments, so-called, had inconsistent policy practices. For the neoliberal Democrats, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit on each of these two strands, for the neoliberal Democrats, they distinguish, or they see a bifurcated left, you know, between two lefts, a moderate and a radical camp, or what Jorge Castañeda called the good and the bad left. So the radical versus the moderate left in traditional Marxists more or less stuck up in that way. You know, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua would be more radical, whereas Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay would be seen as much more on the neoliberal side, much more moderate. One example of the traditional Marxists would be James Petra's critique, which had to say the following in terms of Venezuela. He could criticize Venezuela's Bolivarian socialism, also Bolivia's communitarian socialism, and Ecuador's citizens' revolution, considering that all of them closely got involved, you know, these governments, with multinationals and a continuation of the extractivist model of economic growth. And therefore, there was no real rupture with neoliberalism. So Jeffrey Weber and William Robinson, other traditional Marxist critics, in this case, they invoke Antonio Gramsci's concept of passive revolution. And what this concept says is that mobilization from below tends to be contained by the state, co-opted, and or selectively repressed. And so the result is that the initiative of the dominant classes is restored. Bolivia's is an example. Bolivia's insurrectionary cycle became interrupted. It went back into parliamentary politics, and therefore neoliberalism was reconstructed. Mind you, these thinkers tend to be of the ruptural type of strategies, for social transformation. So they would advocate a more Leninist type of transformation, all right? So that's why they're disappointed with this kind of left that's trying to depend exclusively on electoral processes, and they see them as not going anywhere fast. So a research puzzle that we will try to operationalize is, I call it research puzzle A. So was it a left turn or a pink tide? And of course, this epithet of pink tide is a derisory type of epithet that, this left was very heavy on rhetoric and very thin on practice. But still, the question emerges, okay, so how leftist are governments in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador compared to what they see as the more moderate counterparts in Brazil and Chile? What factors can account for variation within and between these country groupings, if any? So moving on, before presenting my data, moving on to the liberal democratic critique. Jorge G. Castañeda had already introduced this, talking about a good versus a bad left. The good left is described as pragmatic, sensible, realistic, honest, responsible, and humanized. And examples would be Brazil, Chile, Uruguay. And then the bad left would be constituted by the nationalist, populist, and statist, or simply dishonest and irresponsible left. And examples given would be Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Argentina. Notice that Argentina appears in two different lists here. So for these liberal democratic thinkers, the bad versus the good left would be, or would stack up as follows. Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Argentina would be bad, whereas Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay would be good. I suppose Ecuador would be among the bad, but I'm not sure about that. So what's clear is that there is a controversy over Argentina because it qualifies as the bad left for Castañeda type analysis, and there were many other analysts that more or less repeated Castañeda's type of classification. Social, it has been regarded as a social democratic and capitalist for traditional Marxists, so moderate. And it has been also considered as moderate left, like Brazil, for other observers like the ones cited there. So the research puzzle B that emerges from this discussion is how those variations in Latin America's leftist governments from moderation to radicalism play out in our quantitative assessment of the SDI. And notice that I am talking in plural here in our assessment, And that's because I've been doing this research with my former doctoral student, Efe-Can Gürcan, who is an associate professor of international studies at İTİNE University in Istanbul, Turkey. So is this variation consistent with the mainstream literature's portrayal of bifurcated Latin American leftist governments? So this is what we will try to adjudicate. And our initial hypothesis is that there is an inaccuracy of the liberal democratic strand, because there is no such a thing as a coherent bloc of radical and moderate lefts. The claim that the so-called moderate countries are more efficient and successful is not supported by empirical data. So, research puzzle B. No, wait a minute, I already did that. So, moving forward, how leftist is the Latin American left? This image, by the way, comes from after 2015, where a lot of leftist governments started to be in trouble, lose power. But now that there is a resurgence, this debate has been rekindled. And so I think it's worth getting into what's happened. The left turn definitely rejects neoliberalism, but there was setbacks since 2015 that rekindled this debate. I already mentioned that. And so the question is, has the left presented a genuine social democratic challenge to neoliberal capitalism? So let me start by defining a few things. What is social democracy in the first place? Well, drawing from this very literature, we derive all the indicators that we use to construct our index from this literature. Okay, so we're not inventing the wheel, all right? We're just taking the literature seriously and then trying to operationalize how we could adjudicate their hypotheses with empirical data. So social democracy is the quest for economic equality, expansion of welfare provisions, for example, expansion of income and gender equality, social spending, employment, and wages. So expansion of wages. Guarantee democracy, civil liberties, free elections, separation of powers, and independent courts. Social democracy is not, this is very important to clarify, it is not state socialism, all right? So the social part of social democracy alludes to the left with a socialistic orientation, but socialism doesn't have to be state-directed socialism. In this case, of course, it is a democratic kind of socialism that we're referring to. And so this democratic aspect diverges from the Soviet tradition and the one-party state and the state-controlled economy. In fact, the market economy continues to be a critical sector of society in social democratic societies. So a definition of the left, this is one of two slides. Political or social movements that rhetorically, if not always substantively, prioritize the social democratic issues of social justice, equality, and democracy. It includes both moderate reformers and revolutionaries. It sees main inequalities as artificial constructs. To that extent, those constructs can be deconstructed. So it seeks to overcome those inequalities by state action. So it is not state socialism, but the state can still modify social outcomes, all right? To, for instance, protect individuals from market insecurity because the market's still there, right? But it creates a lot of market insecurities, well, then the state can be protective of those individuals. And then it can also strengthen the voice and voter turnout of underprivileged groups. Pretty much the opposite of what Republicans are doing in the United States. So operationalizing social democracy, in other words, with those definitions of social democracy, how can we operationalize it, to generate a social democracy index? Well, we took these 6 indicators: income inequality, employment rates, minimum real wages, tax revenue, social spending, and democracy. And each of them has been operationalized. In the case of income equality, we use the inverse of the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality. It goes from 0 to 1. 0 would be the situation which is most equitable. Everybody would have about the same level of wealth and income, whereas 1 would be the opposite. A single individual would hold all the wealth and all the income. So we invert that and turn it into a percentage. And then we do the same with employment rates. We invert unemployment to figure out what are the employment rates. So the higher the employment rates, the more social democratic a country will be. The same for minimum real wages. The higher they are, the more social democratic. Tax revenues, same, because they can serve for social spending and even for promoting democracy. So those are our indicators. So with the SDI, the first 5 indicators measure the left's commitment to the working class, and the Gini coefficient, turned into a percentage, is used to assess income inequality. So moving into the results of the Social Democracy Index. I'm going to present you 2 sets of data that are divided along the lines of 2 different temporal periods. The first one is the commodities boom period, only from 2000 to 2014, and even by 2014, we see that things are starting to go south for some countries. But at this point, at least, we see that Venezuela is not doing too bad at all. Okay, I mean, it's number 5 in this sample. Colombia and Mexico are at the bottom, although they were improving a bit. But even Nicaragua, surpassed the SDI, the Social Democracy Index. Bolivia actually performed considerably well in the Social Democracy Index. Ecuador also. So I guess we can't really identify a clear pattern between moderate and radical left here. But we can see a pattern that the staunch neoliberal countries are at the rock bottom here. So let me present now just a comparison of the initial and the final years. So I'm comparing basically 2000 against 2014, and here I'm ranking the countries by the last period. So in the last period, Argentina was doing the best, even though it was considered as irresponsible and all kinds of epithets as a bad left for Castañeda. It was doing almost just about as well as Brazil. This seems to be a tie, but if you expand the decimal points here, Argentina has a tiny advantage, all right? And that's why it's placed first. Uruguay, continues to do very good. Notice that in the case of Uruguay, it started the period really well, and so its increase is not very dramatic. But all the countries had some level of improvement, even Mexico, although Mexico had a fairly small improvement from 0.24 to 0.27. Okay, now, this is the boom years. Now I'm extending this period by 5 years to 2019, which is the last year for which we have data. All right. And here things go really south, particularly for Venezuela. They actually don't do too bad for other countries, except that Uruguay really takes off in terms of the social democracy index. So that would probably indicate that it is much less dependent on extractivism than, well, certainly than Venezuela, which depends on about 98% of its foreign revenues from the exportation of oil. And so, there were many things that happened here. One of them is that, in this decade, the United States was transformed from a heavily oil imports dependent country. In 2008, it was still importing about 63% of its domestic oil consumption, the United States. And a lot of that came from Venezuela. But during the years after that, there was the development of the fracking industry, to the point that the United States stopped being dependent on oil imports. Okay. And so it could even afford engaging in a tremendous boycott of Venezuela. And that's what happened. And so what we see here, comparing once again the initial year of 2000 versus 2019, we see that Venezuela is the only country to experience a fairly dramatic collapse of its social democracy index. All other countries continue to see a little bit of progress, even through, the post-commodities boom period. So, what does this mean? Well, I'm not going to go through these graphs, but just to point out that Mexico is by far the largest exporter to the United States. Maybe that explains why, such incredible dependency on the part of Mexico keeps it at the rock bottom of the social democracy index, very close to the bottom. So, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about my hypothesis A and hypothesis B. So conclusions on hypothesis A: several leftist governments had substantial social democratic achievements since electoral victory. Venezuela's case, though, supports hypothesis A, that it was all this Bolivarian revolution was ultimately mostly rhetoric. And conclusions on hypothesis B: however, the larger rule is that so-called, derisively called, pink-tide countries did not do as bad as traditional Marxists and liberal Democrats predicted. In fact, there was a significant social democratic advancement, advancements have been recorded with higher SDI scores for most, in fact, except for Venezuela. So hypothesis A and B converge on Venezuela. On the radical or bad left variants, A and B coincide. And they are confirmed for Venezuela's case. But the US promoted, as already mentioned, foreign involvement, sanctions, and an economic blockade that must be factored into an understanding of Venezuela's collapse after 2014. So, toward a more nuanced analysis, and I believe this is my last chart, the portrayal of the so-called moderate left as efficient, pragmatic, and responsible, and the radical left as inefficient and irresponsible, does not meet our empirical test, again, with the exception of Venezuela and the US intervention in this particular case. So beyond dependency and extractivism, this is definitely my last slide, trying to step back from the data. What can we say? Well, I would say that the communitarian or the autonomist left and the social democratic left should try to converge into a post-development project that considers community level needs. Why do I say that? Well, because in most of the countries, but particularly perhaps in the case of Ecuador, but also Bolivia and in Mexico, the communitarian left is adamantly opposed to the social democratic government. They can't even talk to each other. In the case of Andrés Manuel López Obrador's government, he sent Father Solalinde, these very activist human rights father, from the Catholic Church, to try and negotiate with the Zapatistas. No way, they wouldn't even talk with him. In the case of Ecuador, there's a big split between the communitarian left and the social democratic left. So, but my conclusion in this regard is that if we are to see popular social democratic advances, we really need both bottom-up and top-down impetus to advance in that direction. And that's it for me. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, for this talk that makes us reflect on the legacy of the left and the future of governance, like the relationship between the state and communitarian ways of organizing today, which is what you touched at the end. What I think is a fascinating subject. And since this is not my area of expertise, I'm just going to ask very, very basic question. And the question has to do with the empirical methodologies that you use to come to these conclusions. So in your experience as a social scientist, why is it more reliable to think in empirical terms and go beyond ideological affinities to come to conclusions that could predict or read the past and the future of Latin American countries in this regard?
Yes, well, I think the latest Nobel Prizes in economics really confirm the extreme importance of empirical data, because in a very long time, I don't think empirical economists had received the Nobel Prize. And I mean, one of the winners of the Nobel Prize, there were three people that won the Nobel Prize in economics. One for his research with somebody who had passed away, Paul Kruger, but they did a sort of natural experiment between two cities in the United States that were next to each other in different states, one where minimum wages were increased and the other one where they were kept the same. And the myth in economics, theoretically, was that if you increase minimum wages, that's going to generate unemployment. Well, with this natural experiment, they proved otherwise, that in spite of the fact that there was a significant increase in minimum wages in one of the cities, there was no unemployment, no comparable unemployment levels that were lower than the other city where they didn't increase the minimum wage. And I guess, in any science, in physics, physicists operate with models, but models are always only as good as the extent to which those models are sustained by empirical research. I mean, there are a lot of models that are impossible to test because they don't have the instruments to do that. But as long as we can procure instruments to measure some of the sayings that we advocate, I think we're always better off to try to compare our theoretical speculations with empirical data.
Yeah, and my question had to do with like as you were talking, I just saw there's so many variables that can affect the result of a political experiment, or the way we assess social democracy. So why don't we have Cuba in the chart? Like you see Venezuela as the exception, and then do you see some similarities with the Cuban case?
Well, I mean, Cuba is not a democracy by the definitions that we were using here. And I mean, Cuba had a revolution of the Leninist type. It is a state-led, of the Soviet, it's a state socialism. That's what Cuba is. I mean, although they've tried to open the market, they've been extremely timid in opening the market, and they are, very distrustful of Cubans in terms of how much capital Cubans can develop as compared to foreign investors. And I asked that question to Cuban economists in the latest LASA Congress, which was virtual. Why does the Cuban state distrust Cubans? And his answer seemed plausible, that perhaps it's because foreign investors are not going to try to get involved in politics. And so, I mean, Manuel Castells, who is a Spanish sociologist, once contrasted capitalism with socialism, state socialism, by saying, if capitalism is a mode of production that tries to maximize profits, state socialism tries to maximize power, the power of the bureaucracy. So that is not what is being sought in Latin America, as far as I can tell. I mean, all these countries are trying to move into a democratic kind of socialism. Even if they call it socialism, it would be democratic. Otherwise, they don't fulfill, the conditions for the social democracy index. Mind you, you did mention that there are quite a few variables, right? I mean, we only chose 6 variables, 6 indicators. And because we consider that some of those variables are more important than others, we actually utilize a methodology that allows us to place different weights on some of those indicators. I'm not going to get into that. It's kind of complicated, but we have an econometrician that's helping us with this part of the methodology. But we think it's a very strong indicator that we came up with.
Thank you. I have maybe a question, but I think Paloma has a question before.
Sure.
Actually, I was remembering our first Lausanne Long conference 15 years ago was called "What Does the Left Derive? The Performance of the Left in Latin America." So that brought me good memories. My question has to do it's not directly about economic policy, but it's about a number of progressive values that do have an impact in income inequality, like women's rights, equal marriage, reproductive rights. And you will see that in most cases, what you call the bad left, and I don't want to get in trouble, I would call it traditional left, tend to underperform this other more modern left when it comes to that. So can this more traditional left be elected without the young vote? And can the young people put those values aside and then choose them? And then why do you think they tend to be more conservative and progressive values?
Oh, I'm not sure if your audio is not great, and
so
I'm
sorry.
not sure if I captured the question.
Yes.
Yeah, the last part of the question, if you can
Is
reiterate.
why do you think the traditional left underperforms this other left in terms of progressive values, meaning equal marriage, meaning reproductive rights, women's rights, etc.?
Yeah, that's a big puzzle. I mean, I guess that also happens in Cuba, for instance. I think Cuba also has some considerable problems in terms of conservatism, and that's actually also the case for the current president of Mexico. I mean, he's been saying some terrible things about feminism, for instance, and which is very, very paradoxical because, I mean, Andrés Manuel López Obrador's cabinet is paritary. You know, he has more or less equal number of women as men. And the Mexican Congress is also pretty paritary. But still, you know, he does have this alliance, this electoral alliance with a very conservative evangelist party. And so that's, I mean, I'm not really sure why that happens, you know, but now some explanation I heard about that particular alliance is that the evangelists were attracted to López Obrador because, given the fact that the right in Mexico is so Catholic, perhaps the church would be impeded from having too much influence in the state. And so López Obrador would preserve secularism in Mexico and therefore allow the evangelists to thrive, you know, against the Catholics. So, you know, there can be all kinds of explanations that are not very straightforward. I'm not sure, you know, what would be the case in other countries, but, you know, you would have to dig in, you know, for reasons that may seem fairly minute, but you know, when you're talking about an electoral coalition, a few percentage points can make an important difference in winning or losing. And so when it comes to elections, electoral politics, I guess one word to describe them is pragmatism. How will we win? Which is one of the reasons why the communitarian left doesn't like to get into politics, you know, because they're much more guided by principle than by pragmatics.
Gerardo, do you think that like communications and information technology and the globalization of the economies played an important role in why communitarianism and social democracies have challenges, in like why social democratic governments can really not be very appealing to certain communitarian groups that can actually like evolve in better ways through these channels that like tend to fragment the idea of nation state community. And because you end your talk about, you know, how social democracies have to work in conjunction with communitarian-based organizations and associations. But what is like the impact of these other factors, like the digitalization, the technological era, and the globalizing economies, you know, the flow of capital that like actually decentralizes by nature?
Yeah, I mean, they may play a role, but I would argue that the central role that prevents, you know, a greater confluence is material interests. I'll give you a couple of examples. Rafael Correa, in Ecuador, he labeled environmental organizations as, foreign agents, and so because they were impeding or, representing an obstacle to his extractivist policies. And similarly, in the case of Bolivia, you might remember in 2011, there was this big protest around the Tiffany's Park because the indigenous people from the highlands, basically peasant economies, they had an interest in building a road that went through these lowlands, jungle, forest, to reach markets. And the lowland indigenous peoples completely opposed that. So there was some repression, the road was built, and eventually some operatives from the MAS, from the Movimiento al Socialismo, were sent to appease those communities. So they may have been co-opted or at least repressed, and they were neutralized. But that's the problem, that very often, as long as social democratic governments continue with the extractivist policies without, at the same time, taking into account the way in which local communities see the socio-environmental destruction and come up with ways to mitigate that social environmental destruction, there's not going to be a way forward. So, I mean, it's definitely related to material interests.
Yeah, thank you, Gerardo. Thank you so much. Paloma, do we have any other questions from the audience?
No, but I do have one final question, maybe about playing in the international arena. Are the traditional leftist governments less inclined to engage in globalization and in trade and international collaboration than the other left?
Well, I guess that's an empirical question, in the sense that it depends. It depends on which countries we're talking about, because there is a differential in terms of the levels of dependency on foreign exports and so on. And so, for instance, I would say that the more extractivist countries would be more interested in globalization. I mean, that's why James Petras critiques these extractivist countries, because they continue to pump out the oil and export it and so on and so forth, and so they're fairly interested in globalization. So, however, countries that have a more significant industrial base, they could think about some protectionism, guarding the national borders for domestic industry, which is more or less what the Economic Commission for Latin America advocated, since the late 1940s and 1950s. I mean, if you asked the original early economic theorists from Latin America, what has Latin America done wrong? Well, it hasn't promoted industrialization. It hasn't promoted trade integration among Latin American countries. It hasn't had an industrial policy. It had just inserted itself in global capitalism in a completely dependent way, with technological dependency, and the results are visible. I mean, I have, in other research, a series of comparisons between the three North American countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And I mean, in all three countries, workers have actually lost in terms of their share of GDP compared to capital. So the winners have been basically the automobile industry, which is the most integrated. And Mexico is the third trade partner of the United States. And at the same time, Mexico, what is the comparative advantage of Mexico? Cheap wages. I mean, that's how Mexico sold itself to join the North American Free Trade Agreement, cheap wages. And tragically, its technocrats never did anything other than to keep a lid on wages in Mexico, so that comparative advantage always stayed the same. And if you compare, GDP per capita in the three countries, in both Canada and the United States, they converge upwards, whereas Mexico's is stagnant, almost stagnant. I mean, there was a little bit of growth. I mean, I have data from, early on until 2019 or so, and the growth there was prior to NAFTA. After NAFTA, the growth in GDP per capita has been much more modest than prior to Mexico becoming integrated into North America. And 80% of Mexico's trade is with the United States. So, it's extremely dependent.
Yeah, well, I think if we have a question here from Facebook. How will the libertarian left look at Latin America's potential for the decarbonization? Is there a green, pink left?
Is there a green left?
A green, pink left.
Oh, okay. Well, I think there is. The question is whether it is in power or not. I would say it is not. The left that is in power, I think, continues to be very petro-dependent, unfortunately. And so it's going to be a huge challenge for a number of countries. I mean, from Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, I mean, even Brazil. I mean, Brazil has a very substantial oil industry. Maybe not necessarily very dependent in exports, but for its domestic industry, it is very dependent on oil. So I think oil dependency all along in Latin America is very, very deep. And so what needs to happen also for a green left project is to really figure out how Latin America can develop new industries, new technologies toward a green transition. I mean, they have to think about how to generate new jobs from new industries. I can't say that Mexico is at the forefront of that. Contrary can be said of that.
A lot of challenges ahead for Latin America. But you left your study very, very suggestively in 2019. So let's wait for the next round, and you come back, and we'll keep exploring. Thank you so much, sure. Gerardo. It's a pleasure to host you, and we hope that next time is in person, and you can come back to Austin and enjoy the Sid Richardson Hall.
I would be delighted to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paloma. Thank you to the audience. And hasta la próxima.